The pen shook in Jonathan Hale's hand as the lawyer slid the marriage contract across the polished table. Outside the window, thunder rolled over the city, but the real storm was sitting 3 feet away from him, wrapped in a plain gray coat, refusing to meet his eyes. Her name was Elena Rhodes, and in less than 10 minutes, she would become his wife. He did not want this. He had never wanted this. "Sign it, Jonathan," his grandfather said from the hospital bed that had been wheeled into the private office for this exact purpose. The old man's voice was weak, but his eyes were sharp, locked on his grandson, with the same stubborn fire that had built an empire from nothing. "This is the last thing I will ever ask of you." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He looked at Elena, really looked at her for the first time since she had walked into the room. She was younger than he expected, with dark hair pulled back tightly, and hands folded so still in her lap that they looked carved from stone. She did not look like a woman marrying for love. She looked like a woman being sentenced. "Why her?" Jonathan asked, not bothering to lower his voice, as if she were not sitting right there. "Out of every family in this city, why does it have to be the Rhodes name tied to mine?" His grandfather's hand trembled as he reached for the glass of water on the tray beside him. "Because I made a promise a long time ago, and I intend to keep it before I die. You will understand later. For now, all I need is your signature." Elena finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "You do not have to explain anything to him on my account. I already know he does not want this." The words landed harder than Jonathan expected. He had spent 3 years building walls so thick that nothing touched him anymore. Not his mother's worry, not his board's concerns, not even his own reflection in the mirror some mornings. But something about the calm way she said it, the total lack of self-pity in her tone, made his fingers pause over the paper. "You do not know anything about me," he said. "I know enough," Elena replied, lifting her chin slightly. "I know that you are only doing this because a dying man asked you to. I know that the moment the ink dries, you will go back to pretending I do not exist. That is fine. I did not come here for romance. I came here because my family needed this alliance to survive, and because apparently, so does yours." Jonathan almost smiled at the sharpness in her voice, but he caught himself. He was not here to admire her. He was here because 2 months ago, his grandfather had suffered a heart attack that nearly killed him, and in the fear that followed, the old man had extracted one final promise from his only grandson: marry the daughter of Nora and the late Edward Rhodes, and do it before the season changed. Nobody had explained why it had to be her family. Nobody had explained why his grandfather's eyes turned wet whenever her name was mentioned. Jonathan had asked his mother, Margaret, but she only pressed her lips together and said, "Some debts are older than you," and left it at that. He signed the paper. The lawyer collected the documents with the practiced efficiency of a man who had seen 100 loveless contracts disguised as marriages, and within 20 minutes, Elena Rhodes became Elena Hale. There was no music, no celebration, no rings exchanged with trembling joy. There was only the scratch of 2 pens and the low hum of a hospital machine, monitoring an old man's heartbeat. As they left the office, Jonathan's driver, Patrick, opened the car door for Elena first, an old habit of courtesy that seemed almost cruel given the circumstances. She slid into the back seat without a word, her hands returning to that same folded position in her lap. Jonathan got in on the other side and stared out the window the entire ride to the Hale estate, refusing to look at the woman now legally bound to his name. The estate itself was enormous, a stone mansion, surrounded by gardens that had been meticulously kept for 3 generations. Elena stepped out of the car and looked up at it, the way someone might look at a beautiful prison. The staff had gathered near the entrance, curious eyes following the new arrival, whispers already beginning behind polite smiles. Margaret Hale stood at the top of the steps, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She did not rush down to embrace her new daughter-in-law. She simply watched Elena climb the stairs, her eyes sweeping over the plain gray coat, the modest shoes, the lack of any jewelry beyond a small silver chain around her neck. "So you are the one," Margaret said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "I hope you understand what you have walked into." "I think I am beginning to," Elena answered. Jonathan brushed past both of them without a word and disappeared into the house. He had a meeting to prepare for, a board to convince, a company to run, And none of that had time to pause simply because a stranger now occupied one of the guest wings under the title of his wife. He told himself this was temporary, a formality that would fade into the background of his real life soon enough. He told himself he would barely have to see her at all. He was wrong, though he did not know it yet. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Jonathan sat alone in his private study on the second floor, a room lined with old books and a single locked door in the far corner that no one in the household was permitted to enter. He held a glass of dark liquor he had no real intention of finishing and stared at the framed photograph on his desk, the only photograph in the entire house that showed genuine happiness on his face. The woman in the photograph had light brown hair, laughing eyes, and a smile that used to make him forget every hard thing about his life. Her name had been Mia. 3 years ago, she had died in a car accident on a rain-soaked road outside the city, and Jonathan had spent every single day since then pretending that the hollow feeling in his chest was manageable, that time was healing something it had, in fact, only frozen. He had never told anyone the full truth of what happened that night. He had never told anyone that the last thing he said to her was something cruel, something he had never gotten the chance to take back. Grief had made him cold, and cold had become armor, and armor had become the only version of himself he knew how to be anymore. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. He did not answer, hoping whoever it was would simply leave. The door opened anyway, just slightly, and Elena's voice came through the gap. "I am sorry to disturb you. I could not find the kitchen, and I did not want to wander the halls of a house I do not know without permission." Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, tucking the photograph face down beneath a stack of papers, before turning toward her. Down the main stairs, second door on the left. She nodded and lingered for a moment longer than necessary, her gaze drifting past him, toward the locked door in the corner of the study, the one with a small brass plaque that had clearly been unscrewed and turned around so no one could read what it said. "What is behind that door?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "Nothing that concerns you," Jonathan said, sharper than he intended. Elena's expression did not flinch. She simply nodded once, said goodnight, and closed the door behind her, leaving him alone again, with a photograph he refused to look at twice in one evening, and a wife he had no intention of getting to know. Downstairs, Elena found the kitchen exactly where he said it would be, though it was empty at this hour except for a single lamp left burning over the stove. She poured herself a glass of water and sat at the long wooden table, staring at nothing in particular, trying to process the sheer strangeness of her new life. She had grown up in a modest house on the edge of the city, raised mostly by her mother after her father passed away when she was young. There had been years of struggle, years of watching her mother work long hours just to keep food on the table, years of watching the family name slowly lose whatever standing it once had. When her mother came to her 3 months ago, with tears in her eyes, explaining that an old family debt could finally be settled, that a marriage to the Hale family would save them from a financial collapse that had been building for years, Elena had not hesitated for long. She agreed, not because she wanted a husband who despised her on sight, but because she had learned early in life that survival sometimes required sacrifice. Still, there was something strange gnawing at the edges of her mind since she arrived at this house, something she could not quite name. It had started the moment she stepped through the front gate, a flicker of familiarity in the shape of the gardens, in the smell of the roses lining the walkway, in the sound of the fountain near the east wing. She told herself it was simply nerves, the mind playing tricks in an unfamiliar place, but the feeling had not faded. If anything, it had grown stronger the longer she stayed inside these walls. She thought of the locked door upstairs, the way Jonathan's entire body had gone rigid when she asked about it, the desperate way he had tucked something beneath his papers before turning to face her. Whatever was behind that door mattered to him more than anything else in this house. She could tell that much simply from the look in his eyes, a look she recognized instantly, because she had seen it before, somewhere, on someone. She just could not remember where. The following morning, Elena rose early out of habit, long before the rest of the household stirred. She found her way to the garden, drawn by the same strange pull she had felt the night before, and stood quietly among the roses as the sun began to rise over the estate. A gardener named Louise, an older woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands from the morning's baking, greeted her with a polite nod. "You are up early, Mrs. Hale," Louise said, testing the new title carefully, as if unsure whether it was welcome. I could not sleep, Elena admitted. This garden is beautiful. It feels oddly familiar, though I know I have never been here before. Louise's expression shifted for just a moment, something flickering behind her eyes before she composed herself again. Gardens have a way of feeling that way to people. Roses are roses everywhere, I suppose. But there was hesitation in her voice, a beat too long before the explanation came, and Elena noticed it the same way she noticed most things, quietly and without comment. She thanked Louise for the kind welcome and continued walking through the garden paths, unaware that behind her, Louise remained frozen near the rose bushes, staring after her with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and fear. Inside the house, Jonathan stood at his bedroom window, watching the same scene unfold below. He had not intended to watch her. He had woken early for a business call and simply happened to glance outside, only to find his gaze locked on the woman walking through his grandmother's old rose garden, with an ease that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. She moved through the space like she already knew every turn of the path, every bench tucked behind the hedges, every hidden corner where the morning light fell just right. It reminded him of someone, though he refused to let the thought fully form. He turned away from the window and told himself, once again, that this marriage meant nothing beyond the paperwork, that whatever strange sense of recognition kept creeping up his spine whenever Elena was near was nothing more than grief confusing his mind with things that were not real. Mia was gone. He had buried that truth so deep inside himself that even now, standing in a house filled with reminders, he refused to let it surface. But grief, as Jonathan would soon learn, does not stay buried forever. Not when the thing it is mourning is standing in the very same garden, breathing the very same air, closer to him than he could possibly imagine. By mid-morning, the household had fully woken, and the quiet tension between Jonathan and Elena had settled into something colder and more permanent. He left for his office without a word to her, leaving instructions with the staff that his wife was to be given anything she required, though he made no effort to define what that meant beyond basic comfort. Margaret watched her son leave with a troubled expression, then turned to Elena, who stood near the entryway looking lost in a house that offered no true welcome. "He will come around eventually," Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Or he will not, and you will simply have to build a life around his absence. Either way, you are here now, and there is no changing that." "I did not expect kindness," Elena said honestly. "I only hope, in time, there might at least be peace." Margaret studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, the same flicker of hesitation Louise had shown in the garden. "Peace," she repeated softly, almost to herself. "That would be a fine thing to hope for in this house." She turned and walked away, before Elena could ask what she meant, leaving her standing alone, in the grand entryway of a home that felt, impossibly, like it already knew her name. 3 days passed before Jonathan spoke to Elena again, and even then, it was only because circumstance forced them into the same room. A dinner had been arranged with a group of investors from overseas, men whose confidence in the Hale Company depended, in part, on seeing a stable and respectable family behind the name. Margaret had insisted that Elena attend, dressed properly, seated beside her husband, playing the role expected of her, whether either of them liked it or not. Elena stood in front of the mirror in her room that evening, wearing a deep blue dress that Margaret had sent up earlier in the day without explanation. It fit her perfectly, which struck her as strange, since no one had taken her measurements since she arrived. She smoothed the fabric at her waist and studied her reflection, trying to recognize the woman staring back at her. Something about the dress felt like it belonged to someone else, though she could not explain why. A knock came at the door, and Louise entered carrying a small velvet box.
"Mrs. Hale asked me to bring this up for you,"
she said, her voice carefully neutral. Inside the box was a delicate necklace, a thin gold chain with a single pearl pendant, simple, but clearly valuable. Elena lifted it carefully, and the moment her fingers touched the pearl, a sharp, unexplainable ache bloomed behind her eyes, quick and gone, before she could even register it as pain. "Are you all right?" Louise asked, stepping forward. "I am fine," Elena said, blinking away the strange sensation. "Just tired, I think." Louise helped her fasten the necklace, her hands trembling slightly as she worked the clasp, though Elena did not notice. When she finally looked up and caught Louise's expression in the mirror, She saw something close to sorrow written across the older woman's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. Downstairs, Jonathan waited near the entrance to the dining hall, adjusting his cufflinks with the mechanical precision of a man preparing for a performance rather than a meal. When Elena descended the staircase, something in his chest tightened unexpectedly. The dress, the necklace, the way the light caught her hair as she moved, all of it struck him with a force he was not prepared for. "You look," he started, then stopped himself, unsure why the words had come so easily, unsure why he had almost said something warmer than he intended. "You do not have to finish that sentence," Elena said, misreading his hesitation as reluctance. "I know this is a performance for tonight. I will play my part." Jonathan said nothing, though the tightness in his chest did not ease. Throughout dinner, he watched her more closely than he meant to, noticing the graceful way she handled the investors' questions, the calm confidence in her voice, despite clearly being unfamiliar with half the business terms being discussed, the small, private smile she offered one of the older guests who told a joke that no one else found particularly funny. It was such a small thing, that smile, but it hit Jonathan like a blow to the chest. He had seen that exact smile before, years ago, across a different table, in a different life. He gripped his wine glass tighter and forced his attention back to the conversation, telling himself once again that grief was simply playing cruel tricks on his mind. After the guests left and the house settled into its late-night quiet, Jonathan found himself standing outside Elena's door, unsure why his feet had carried him there. He raised his hand to knock, then lowered it, then raised it again, annoyed with his own indecision. Finally, the door opened before he could decide, and Elena stood there, still in the blue dress, the pearl necklace catching the hallway light. "Did you need something?" she asked, clearly surprised to find him standing there. "I wanted to say that tonight went well," Jonathan said, the words feeling stiff and unnatural coming out of his mouth. The investors were pleased. "I am glad the performance was convincing," Elena replied, though there was no real bitterness in her voice, only a quiet exhaustion. Jonathan hesitated, his eyes drifting to the necklace at her throat. "Where did you get that? Your mother sent it up with the dress. Why? Is something wrong?" Jonathan did not answer immediately. He remembered that necklace. He remembered buying it, years ago, for a woman who had loved simple, quiet things over anything expensive or extravagant. He remembered clasping it around her neck himself, in this very house, in a different lifetime that he had spent 3 years trying to forget. Seeing it now, resting against Elena's skin, sent a cold shock through his entire body. "Nothing is wrong," he said finally, though his voice had lost its earlier steadiness. "Good night, Elena." He turned and walked away quickly, leaving her standing in the doorway, confused by the sudden change in his demeanor. She closed the door slowly, her fingers brushing against the pearl pendant, and for reasons she could not explain, she felt an overwhelming urge to cry, though no specific memory or thought seemed to justify the emotion. It simply rose up from somewhere deep and unreachable, then faded just as suddenly, leaving her hollow and confused in its wake. The following days brought small, strange moments that neither of them could fully explain. Elena found herself humming a tune one afternoon, while arranging flowers in the sitting room, a melody she did not remember learning, and Jonathan, passing by in the hallway, stopped dead in his tracks, his face draining of color. He did not explain his reaction. He simply turned and walked away, leaving her more confused than before. Another time, she reached for a teacup in the kitchen cabinet without looking, her hand finding the exact one Louise always used for afternoon tea, tucked behind a row of identical cups where a stranger to the house would have no reason to know it existed. Louise watched this from across the room, her hands frozen mid-task, staring at Elena with an expression that bordered on fear. "How did you know that cup was there?" Louise asked quietly. Elena looked down at the cup in her hand, genuinely puzzled by the question. "I am not sure. It just felt right." Louise did not respond. She simply excused herself and left the kitchen, her footsteps quick and unsteady, leaving Elena alone with a teacup she could not explain knowing, and a growing sense that something important was being hidden from her, something the entire household seemed to understand except for her. That evening, driven by a curiosity she could no longer ignore, Elena made her way back to Jonathan's private study, drawn once again to the locked door in the corner. She knew she should not pry into things that were not her business, especially in a marriage built on obligation rather than trust, but the pull toward that door had become impossible to resist. She tried the handle gently, expecting it to be locked as before, and was startled when it gave way slightly under her hand. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder to make sure the hallway was empty, then pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The room was dim, lit only by the pale moonlight filtering through a single curtained window. As her eyes adjusted, she realized she was standing in what looked like a shrine, carefully preserved and untouched by time. A large portrait hung on the far wall, illuminated faintly by the moonlight, and when Elena's gaze fell upon it, her breath caught painfully in her throat. The woman in the portrait had a familiar shape to her face, a familiar tilt to her smile, though her hair was different, lighter, and something about the structure of her cheekbones did not quite match the reflection Elena saw in mirrors every day. Still, the resemblance was undeniable, close enough to send a wave of dizziness rushing through her, close enough that she had to grip the edge of a nearby table to keep herself steady. Scattered across the room were other reminders of this unnamed woman, framed photographs showing her laughing beside a younger version of Jonathan, handwritten letters tied together with faded ribbon, a single worn scarf draped carefully over the back of a chair, as though someone still expected her to return and claim it. Elena's hands trembled as she picked up one of the photographs, staring into the eyes of a woman who looked like a distorted echo of herself, a stranger and a mirror all at once. Footsteps sounded suddenly in the hallway outside, sharp and quick, and Elena barely had time to set the photograph down and step back from the portrait before the door swung open fully, revealing Jonathan standing in the frame, his face contorted with a mixture of horror and fury that she had never seen from him before. "Get out," he said, his voice low and shaking. "Get out of this room right now." "Jonathan, I did not mean to. I said get out." His voice rose sharply, echoing off the walls of the small, sacred space he had built around a memory he refused to release. Elena moved quickly past him into the hallway, her heart pounding, and when she turned back, she saw him standing frozen in the doorway, staring at the portrait, as though seeing it for the first time in years, his shoulders trembling with a grief he had spent 3 years trying to bury beneath silence and cold indifference. She did not say anything further. She simply walked away, leaving him alone with whatever memory had just been disturbed, though the image of that portrait remained burned behind her eyes long after she returned to her own room. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands, trying to understand why looking at a stranger's face had felt less like discovering a secret and more like remembering something she had lost a long time ago, something just beyond the reach of memory, waiting patiently in the dark for her to finally turn around and see it clearly. Sleep did not come easily to Jonathan that night. He sat in his study long after the house had gone silent, the portrait's presence pressing against his thoughts like a weight he could not set down. He had built that room 3 years ago as a place to grieve privately, away from his mother's worried glances and his colleagues' careful sympathy, and no one had ever been allowed inside except himself. Seeing Elena standing there, holding one of Mia's photographs, had felt like a violation, though some quieter part of him, one he refused to listen to, whispered that it had felt like something else entirely. Recognition, perhaps, or relief. He poured himself a drink he did not finish, and stared at the closed door of the shrine, replaying the moment Elena had turned to face him, her eyes wide with something closer to confusion than guilt. She had not looked like an intruder caught in an act of disrespect. She had looked like someone waking up in an unfamiliar room, trying desperately to remember how she got there. The next morning, Jonathan found Elena in the small breakfast room overlooking the eastern garden, sitting alone with a cup of tea she had not touched. He hesitated in the doorway, unsure of what to say after the previous night's outburst, then finally stepped inside and took the seat across from her. "I owe you an explanation," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "for how I reacted." Elena looked up at him, surprised by the admission. "You do not owe me anything. It was your private space. I should not have gone in." "Her name was Mia," Jonathan said, ignoring her attempt to smooth over the moment. "She died 3 years ago, a car accident, late at night, on the old coastal road outside the city. We were supposed to be married that spring." Elena's hands tightened slightly around her teacup. "I am so sorry, Jonathan. I did not know." "No one really talks about it anymore," he said, staring at some fixed point on the table, rather than at her. My family prefers to pretend it did not happen. It is easier for them that way. I let them believe I have moved past it, because it is simpler than explaining that some days, I still expect her to walk through the front door. There was a rawness in his voice that Elena had not heard from him before, a crack in the cold exterior he had maintained since the day they signed the marriage contract. She wanted to reach across the table and offer some comfort, but she did not know if he would welcome it, so she simply sat quietly and let him speak. The portrait unsettled you last night, Jonathan continued, finally looking up at her. Why? Elena considered the question carefully before answering, because for a moment, looking at her face, I felt like I was looking at a memory of my own, except it was not mine. I cannot explain it better than that. It frightened me. Jonathan studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Her hair was lighter than yours. Her voice was different too, from what I remember. But there is something in the way you tilt your head when you are thinking, something in your laugh, that reminds me of her more than I would like to admit. The confession seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised Elena, as though the words had slipped out before he could stop them. He stood abruptly, mumbling something about an early meeting, and left the room before either of them could examine the strange tension that had settled between them. Elena remained at the table long after he left, turning his words over in her mind. She thought of the pearl necklace that had sent an inexplicable ache through her skull, the teacup she had known without knowing how, the melody she had hummed without remembering where she learned it, the rose garden that felt like home despite her never having visited it before this week. Individually, each strange moment could be dismissed as coincidence. Together, they formed a pattern she could not ignore any longer. That afternoon, she decided to visit her mother, hoping that being surrounded by familiar things might help settle the unease building inside her. She took the car alone, telling Patrick she preferred the walk from the corner rather than being dropped directly at the door, and made her way to the modest house on the edge of the city where she had grown up. Her mother, Nora Rhodes, opened the door before Elena even reached it, her face lighting up with relief at the sight of her daughter, though something tense lingered behind her eyes that Elena had grown used to seeing over the past few months. They sat together in the small kitchen, and Elena described, carefully at first, the strange sensations that had followed her since arriving at the Hale estate. Nora's hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea, and she avoided her daughter's gaze for longer than felt natural. It is a big adjustment, moving into a house like that. It is only natural to feel disoriented. It is more than disorientation, Mother, Elena pressed gently. I knew where a certain teacup was hidden in their kitchen before anyone told me. I hummed a song I have never heard before in my life. There is a portrait in that house of a woman who looks enough like me that Jonathan mistook the resemblance for something painful. Nora's cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down too quickly, tea spilling slightly over the rim. Elena, please, do not chase shadows in that house. Whatever strange coincidences you are experiencing, they are only coincidences, nothing more. You are hiding something, Elena said quietly, watching her mother's reaction carefully. I can see it in your face. You have looked at me this way since the day I agreed to this marriage. Nora's composure finally cracked, just slightly, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, before she blinked them away and forced a tight, unconvincing smile. There is nothing to tell, sweetheart. Your father is gone, and I have made mistakes trying to protect this family since then. But none of that has anything to do with strange feelings in an unfamiliar house. Please, let it go. Elena did not press further, though she left her mother's house that evening, with more questions than she arrived with, a hollow unease settling deeper into her chest. She noticed, on her way out, a framed photograph on the hallway shelf that had always been there for as long as she could remember, one showing herself as a small child standing beside her father before he passed away. Something about the photograph caught her eye differently this time, though she could not immediately identify what had changed. She picked it up, studying the edges of the frame, and noticed a faint discoloration along one corner, as though the photograph inside had been swapped at some point for another that fit slightly differently within the same frame. She said nothing to her mother about the discovery, tucking the strange detail away alongside all the others she had gathered since arriving at the Hale estate. Something was being hidden from her, something large enough that both her own family and Jonathan's household seemed determined to keep buried. She did not yet understand what that something was, but she understood, with growing certainty, that the answer mattered more than anyone around her was willing to admit. Back at the estate that night, Jonathan sat once again in his study, the shrine's door left slightly ajar for the first time in 3 years. He found himself unable to close it fully, some part of him needing to see the portrait from where he sat, needing to study Mia's face and compare it, piece by piece, against the woman now sleeping down the hallway under his name. The similarities gnawed at him relentlessly, a persistent itch beneath his skin that no amount of reasoning could soothe. He thought about calling his private investigator, a sharp, discreet man named Daniel Foss, who had helped the family navigate delicate matters before, but he hesitated, uncertain what exactly he would even ask the man to look into. A resemblance was not evidence of anything. Grief made minds unreliable, prone to seeing ghosts in every unfamiliar face that shared even the smallest similarity with the one they refused to release. Still, as he closed his eyes that night, it was not Mia's face that appeared behind his eyelids, but Elena's, and for the first time in 3 years, the ache in his chest felt less like loss, and more like the confusing, terrifying beginning of something he was not ready to name. 3 years earlier, on a rain-drenched night that no one in the Hale household spoke of anymore, a car had skidded off the coastal road just outside the city, plunging down a shallow embankment before coming to a violent stop against a cluster of trees. Inside that car had been a young woman named Mia Bennett, engaged to be married in a matter of weeks, returning home from a dinner with her mother after an argument with Jonathan that neither of them had gotten the chance to resolve. The details of that argument had haunted Jonathan every day since. He had accused her, in a moment of unfounded jealousy, of spending too much time with a business associate of her family's, a sharp, ambitious man named Victor Callahan, who had been circling the edges of the Hale Company for over a year. Hungry for influence, he had not yet managed to secure through legitimate means. Mia had left the dinner in tears, insisting Jonathan trust her, and he had let his pride keep him from chasing after her car that night. What Jonathan never learned, what no one in his family ever discovered, was that the accident had not been the simple tragedy everyone assumed it to be. Victor Callahan, desperate to prevent a merger between the Hale Company and Mia's family business that would have permanently locked him out of an industry he had spent years trying to infiltrate, had arranged for the brakes of her car to be tampered with, just enough to cause a slow, seemingly natural failure on a dangerous stretch of road. He had not intended for anyone to die. He had only wanted a delay, a crisis significant enough to postpone the merger discussions indefinitely while he maneuvered his own interests into place. Mia survived the crash, though barely. She was pulled from the wreckage by a passing motorist and rushed to a private hospital, where doctors fought for hours to stabilize her. The injuries to her face and skull required extensive reconstructive surgery, and the trauma to her brain left her with severe memory loss, an emptiness where years of her life used to be. When she finally regained enough consciousness to be questioned, she remembered almost nothing beyond fragments. A wedding dress hanging in a closet somewhere, a man's laughter she could not place a face to, a garden filled with roses that ached in her chest without explanation. Her mother, Nora, arrived at the hospital in the chaos following the accident, and it was there, in a private consultation room, that Victor Callahan approached her, with an offer disguised as compassion. He explained, with practiced sincerity, that the Hale family blamed the road's name for whatever business dealings had led to that argument on the night of the crash, that returning Mia to Jonathan, in her fragile, memory-shattered state, would only invite further scrutiny and scandal upon a family already drowning in debt. He offered financial support, quiet and substantial, in exchange for Nora's silence, a chance to relocate, to give her daughter a new name and a new beginning, far from a life that had nearly killed her. Nora, terrified and grieving, believing at the time that she was protecting her daughter from a family who would only bring her more pain, accepted the arrangement without fully understanding the man she was dealing with. Mia became Elena. The Hale family was told, through a carefully falsified death certificate and a private, quiet funeral, attended by no one who might recognize the truth, that the young woman Jonathan had loved was gone forever. Jonathan, consumed by grief and guilt over their final argument, never questioned the story, never demanded to see a body, simply accepted the devastating loss and buried himself in work and silence for 3 long years. Victor Callahan, satisfied that his interference had gone undetected, continued circling the edges of the Hale Company, patiently waiting for another opportunity to insert himself into their affairs. He could not have predicted that years later, a dying grandfather's guilt over debts owed to the Rhodes family would result in Nora's remaining daughter, the one everyone now called Elena, being married directly into the very household he had worked so hard to separate her from. Nora had not known, when she agreed to the marriage arrangement that saved her family from financial ruin, that the man selecting a bride for his grandson's forced marriage was the same man whose company had once been meant to merge with her late husband's business, the same family whose name had been permanently linked to her daughter's presumed death. She had only learned the truth after the contracts were already signed, after it was far too late to undo what had been set into motion, and the horror of that realization had kept her awake every night since, terrified of what might happen if the truth ever surfaced. Elena, of course, remembered none of this. The surgery had altered her appearance just enough that even those who might have recognized Mia Bennett saw only a passing resemblance in Elena Rhodes, easily dismissed as coincidence. The memories that occasionally surfaced, the humming of a song she should not know, the familiarity of a garden she had never visited, the ache behind her eyes when touching a pearl necklace, were the only remaining threads connecting her fractured present to a past that had been carefully, deliberately erased. Somewhere in the city, in an office overlooking the same skyline Jonathan's company towers occupied, Victor Callahan sat reviewing quarterly reports, unaware that the woman he believed to be permanently removed from the equation was now living under the very roof of the family he had spent years trying to undermine. He believed his secret buried as deeply as the false grave that bore Mia Bennett's name, a grave Jonathan visited every year on the anniversary of the accident, laying flowers over a coffin that contained nothing more than carefully placed weight and silence. The truth, however, has a way of resisting containment indefinitely. Memories buried beneath trauma do not disappear so much as wait, quiet and patient, for the right trigger to pull them back into the light. And within the walls of the Hale estate, surrounded by the same roses, the same rooms, and now the same man she had once promised to marry, Elena's buried memories had already begun their slow, painful return, fragment by fragment, though neither she nor Jonathan yet understood the magnitude of what was stirring beneath the surface of their strange, unwanted marriage. The dreams began that same week, sudden and vivid, pulling Elena from sleep with her heart pounding and her skin damp with sweat. In them, she stood on a rain-soaked road at night, headlights flooding her vision, a scream caught somewhere in her throat that never quite escaped. She always woke before the impact, gasping for air in the darkness of her unfamiliar bedroom, unable to explain why a dream about a stranger's accident felt so unbearably close to her own skin. She mentioned the dreams to no one at first, afraid of sounding unstable in a household already watching her with quiet suspicion. But the fragments grew more specific with each passing night. She began to see a face in the dream now, a younger version of Jonathan, laughing beside her in a garden thick with roses, his hand resting warmly against hers, as he spoke words she could never quite hear clearly enough to understand. She would wake from these gentler dreams, feeling an ache of loss so profound, it left her breathless, grieving something she could not name for a love she did not remember having. One afternoon, while helping Louise fold linens in the laundry room, Elena's hand brushed against an old, faded ribbon tucked inside a drawer, meant for spare buttons and thread. The moment her fingers touched the fabric, a sharp, blinding pain shot through her skull, and the room around her seemed to tilt violently to one side. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself, and for a fraction of a second, an image flashed behind her eyes, with startling clarity. A stack of letters, tied together with that exact ribbon, resting on a nightstand beside a bed she somehow knew belonged to her. Elena? Louise's voice sounded distant, muffled, as though coming from underwater. Elena, are you all right? The dizziness passed as quickly as it arrived, leaving Elena breathless and shaken, her hand still clutching the ribbon. I saw something, she whispered, more to herself than to Louise. Letters, tied with this exact ribbon. I do not know why, but I feel certain they were mine. Louise's face drained of color, and this time she did not attempt to disguise her reaction with a polite excuse. She took the ribbon gently from Elena's trembling hand and set it back inside the drawer, her own hands unsteady as she did so. You should rest. These spells cannot be good for you. Louise, Elena said, catching the older woman's wrist before she could turn away. Please, I know you are hiding something from me. Everyone in this house looks at me like I am a ghost they are afraid to acknowledge. What am I missing? Louise's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away, torn between years of loyalty to the Hale family and a growing guilt she could no longer easily silence. "It is not my place to speak of it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are things in this house that belong to the dead, Elena. Sometimes it is safer to let the dead remain undisturbed." She left the laundry room before Elena could press further, leaving behind more questions than answers once again. Elena sat alone amid the folded linens, staring at the drawer that held the ribbon, and felt, for the first time since arriving at the estate, a genuine fear creeping into her chest. Not fear of Jonathan or his cold indifference, but fear of whatever truth was waiting for her at the end of this strange, unraveling thread. That evening, unable to shake the unease building inside her, she wandered the halls of the estate long after the household had gone quiet, drawn once again toward Jonathan's study, though this time she did not attempt to enter the locked shrine. Instead, she found Jonathan himself, sitting at his desk, staring at nothing in particular, a half-empty glass beside him, and an expression of exhaustion carved deeply into his face. "You look like you have not slept properly in days," Elena said softly, standing in the doorway. Jonathan glanced up, momentarily surprised by her presence, then gestured for her to enter. "Neither have you, from the look of things." "I have been having strange dreams," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. She had not planned to tell him anything, yet something about the exhaustion in his own eyes made the confession feel safer than it should have. "A road, at night, in the rain, and sometimes, a garden, and a man who looks remarkably like you, though younger." Jonathan's entire body went rigid, his hand tightening around the glass until his knuckles turned white. "What else do you see in these dreams?" "Letters, tied with a faded ribbon, a pearl necklace that feels like it belongs against my skin, though I have never worn one before this house. A song I hum, without remembering where I learned it." Elena took a hesitant step further into the room. "Jonathan, what is happening to me?" He set the glass down carefully, his mind racing through possibilities he had refused to consider, until this exact moment. Possibilities that felt too impossible, too painful, too dangerous to hope for. He studied her face in the dim light of the study, searching for something he had avoided looking for, directly since the day she arrived, and for the first time, he allowed himself to truly wonder if the impossible thing gnawing at the edges of his sanity might actually be true. "I do not know," he said finally, though the tremor in his voice suggested he was beginning to suspect an answer he was not yet ready to speak aloud. "But I intend to find out." In the days that followed, something shifted between them, subtle at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore. Jonathan found himself seeking Elena out in small, unplanned moments, lingering near the breakfast room a few minutes longer than necessary, asking Louise which garden path Elena preferred for her morning walks, so he might happen to cross it himself. He told himself these were simply the practical concerns of a husband trying to understand a wife thrust upon him by circumstance, nothing more, though the excuses grew thinner with each passing day. Elena, for her part, noticed the change without fully trusting it. She had spent the first week of this marriage bracing herself against Jonathan's coldness, building her own walls in response, and the sudden softening in his manner left her uncertain whether to lower her guard or brace for disappointment. Still, she found herself looking forward to the moments they shared, small as they were: a shared cup of tea in the morning, a quiet conversation about a book left open on the sitting room table, the rare, unguarded laugh that occasionally escaped him before he seemed to remember himself and pull back into careful reserve. A business gala arranged by the Hale Company required their joint attendance the following weekend, and though Jonathan had initially planned to attend alone, citing Elena's unfamiliarity with the social circle as an excuse, he found himself changing his mind at the last moment, informing her instead that her presence would be expected. "I thought I was only required for family functions and investor dinners," Elena said, genuinely surprised by the invitation. "Consider this a family function as well," Jonathan replied, a faint, almost embarrassed smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Besides, I find myself curious what you make of these tedious gatherings. Perhaps your honesty will make the evening more bearable than usual." The gala was held in a grand ballroom downtown, filled with the same polished faces and rehearsed smiles that populated every event of its kind. Elena stayed close to Jonathan's side throughout the evening, and though she had expected the night to feel like another performance, something about his presence beside her made the unfamiliar crowd easier to navigate. He introduced her to colleagues, with a warmth she had not seen from him before, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, in a gesture that felt less like obligation and more like instinct. Midway through the evening, as the orchestra shifted into a slow, gentle waltz, Jonathan extended his hand toward her, without a word of explanation. Elena hesitated only a moment before accepting, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor, among the other couples swaying beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers. "I did not expect you to dance," she admitted, her hand resting lightly against his shoulder. "Neither did I," Jonathan replied, guiding her through the steps with an ease that suggested years of practice, long buried beneath disuse. "It has been a long time since I have wanted to." They moved together in comfortable silence for several minutes, and Elena found herself studying his face more closely than she had allowed herself to before, noticing the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his expression softened when he thought no one was paying close attention. For a fleeting moment, the music swelling around them, she felt an overwhelming sense that she had done this before, danced in his arms exactly like this, in a different room, at a different time, though the memory slipped away before she could grasp its edges. "You are staring," Jonathan said quietly, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I am sorry," Elena said, embarrassed. "You simply remind me of someone, though I cannot place who." Something flickered across his face at her words, quick and unreadable, gone before she could interpret it fully. He pulled her slightly closer as the music continued, and for the remainder of the dance, neither of them spoke again, both lost in a strange, unspoken current of recognition neither was yet prepared to name aloud. Later that night, as the car carried them back toward the estate, Elena rested her head lightly against the window, watching the city lights blur past in the darkness. Jonathan sat beside her, closer than he had at the beginning of the evening, his hand resting near hers on the seat between them, close enough that their fingers brushed occasionally with the gentle motion of the car. "Thank you for tonight," Elena said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "I did not expect to enjoy it as much as I did." "Neither did I," Jonathan admitted, turning to look at her properly for the first time since they left the ballroom. "I have spent 3 years convinced that certain parts of myself were simply gone for good. Tonight, dancing with you, I felt something I thought I had lost permanently." Elena's breath caught slightly at the vulnerability in his voice, so different from the cold stranger who had signed their marriage contract without meeting her eyes. "Perhaps some things are not as lost as we believe them to be," she said quietly. Jonathan did not respond immediately, his gaze lingering on her face in the dim light of the car, searching for something he was beginning to suspect might actually be there, hiding just beneath the surface of a woman he had married as a stranger, and was slowly, impossibly, beginning to fall for all over again. By the time they arrived back at the estate, an unspoken understanding had settled between them, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably present. Jonathan walked her to her door that night, and for a long moment, they simply stood facing each other in the quiet hallway, neither quite willing to say goodnight, both aware that something significant had shifted between them, though neither yet understood exactly what it meant or where it might lead. "Good night, Jonathan," Elena finally whispered, stepping back into her room. "Good night, Elena," he replied, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, lingering in the hallway long after her door had closed, staring at the space where she had stood, as though trying to hold on to whatever fragile warmth had passed between them, before the harsh light of morning could threaten to take it away again. The following morning, Jonathan sat alone in his office downtown, staring at his phone for nearly 20 minutes, before finally dialing the number he had saved, but never called since the year of the accident. Daniel Foss answered on the third ring, his voice calm and businesslike, the voice of a man accustomed to handling delicate matters without judgment or unnecessary questions. "Mr. Hale," Daniel said, "it has been some time. What can I help you with?" Jonathan hesitated, his fingers drumming against the surface of his desk. "I need you to look into someone's background, thoroughly and quietly. My wife, Elena Rhodes. Any particular concern I should be aware of?" Jonathan exhaled slowly, choosing his next words with care. "I need you to look into the medical history of her family, specifically anything related to accidents, hospital records, surgeries, going back at least 3 years. And I need you to review, discreetly, the original documentation surrounding Mia Bennett's death. The death certificate, the hospital that handled her case, anyone who signed off on the paperwork. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Daniel responded, his tone carefully neutral, though clearly surprised by the unexpected direction of the request. "That is an unusual combination of requests, Mr. Hale. May I ask what has prompted this?" "Call it a hunch," Jonathan said. "One I need confirmed or dismissed as quickly as possible." Daniel promised results within the week, and true to his reputation, he delivered even sooner than expected. 4 days later, he requested an in-person meeting, insisting the information he had gathered was too sensitive to discuss over the phone. Jonathan met him in a quiet corner office, away from the main floor of Hale Enterprises, his stomach tight with an anxiety he had not felt in years. Daniel spread a series of documents across the desk between them, his expression unusually grave for a man who typically maintained an air of detached professionalism. The death certificate for Mia Bennett was issued by a private clinic on the outskirts of the city, signed by a doctor who has since left the country and cannot currently be located for verification. There is no accompanying autopsy report, no photographs on file, and the funeral home listed as handling the arrangements has no record of ever receiving a body matching her description. Jonathan's hands had gone cold, his heart pounding painfully against his ribs. "What are you telling me, Daniel?" "I am telling you that the paperwork surrounding Mia Bennett's death does not hold up under scrutiny," Daniel said carefully. "And separately, hospital records from the same private clinic, dated the same week as the accident you described, show a female patient admitted under emergency conditions, matching the details you gave me. Severe head trauma, reconstructive facial surgery, extended memory loss. The patient's name on those records was later changed through a legal petition filed by Nora Rhodes, transitioning a woman named Mia Bennett into the identity currently known as Elena Rhodes." The room seemed to tilt sharply around Jonathan, the weight of 3 years of grief crashing violently against an impossible, overwhelming hope he had not allowed himself to feel since the night of the accident. "She is alive," he whispered, more to himself than to Daniel. "She has been alive this entire time." "It appears so," Daniel confirmed quietly. "Though I would advise caution, Mr. Hale. Whoever orchestrated this transition went to considerable lengths to ensure it remained hidden. I also found indications that the accident itself may not have been entirely accidental. There are notes in an early police report, later dismissed and buried, suggesting the vehicle's brakes showed signs of tampering." Jonathan's jaw tightened as a name surfaced immediately in his mind, a name he had not allowed himself to consider seriously in years. "Victor Callahan." "I cannot confirm that directly," Daniel said carefully, "but given the timing of the merger negotiations that collapsed following the accident, and Mr. Callahan's subsequent acquisition of contracts that would have otherwise gone to the joint venture between your family and the Rhodes family, it would not be an unreasonable conclusion to draw." Jonathan sat in stunned silence for several long moments, processing the enormity of what he had just learned. The woman he had mourned for 3 years, the woman whose portrait he visited nightly in a shrine built from grief and guilt, was alive, sleeping under his own roof, married to him under a stolen identity she did not even remember was originally her own, and the man responsible for the accident that stole 3 years of her life, and 3 years of his own peace, had likely never faced any consequence for his actions. That evening, Jonathan drove directly to Nora Rhodes's modest house on the edge of the city, arriving unannounced, and refusing to leave until she agreed to speak with him. Nora opened the door already pale with dread, as though she had been anticipating this exact confrontation since the day the marriage contract was signed. "You know," Jonathan said, stepping into her small living room without waiting for an invitation, "you have known this entire time." Nora's composure crumbled almost instantly, tears spilling down her cheeks as she sank onto the worn sofa, her hands trembling in her lap. "I did what I believed was necessary to protect her," she said, her voice breaking. "Victor Callahan approached me at the hospital, offering support I desperately needed, convincing me that returning her to your family would only bring more danger, more scandal. I did not know then what I know now, that he was the reason for the accident in the first place." "You let me believe she was dead," Jonathan said, his voice shaking with a fury he could barely contain. "You let me bury an empty coffin. You let me spend 3 years mourning a woman who was alive this entire time, close enough that I could have found her if anyone had simply told me the truth." "I was afraid," Nora whispered. "Afraid of what your family might do. Afraid of losing my only remaining daughter to a story I did not fully understand at the time. By the time I realized the true extent of what had happened, so much time had passed that I did not know how to undo it without destroying everyone involved, including Elena herself. Jonathan stood in the center of her living room, torn between overwhelming anger and an equally overwhelming need to see Elena immediately, to hold on to the truth that had just been confirmed before it could somehow slip away again. She deserves to know who she truly is, he said finally. And Victor Callahan deserves to answer for what he did. Nora nodded weakly through her tears, offering no further resistance. I will help however I can, Jonathan. I owe her that much, after everything my silence has already cost. Jonathan drove back to the estate in a daze, his mind racing through 3 years of grief, now colliding violently with an impossible hope. He found Elena in the sitting room, curled into a chair with a book she was not truly reading, her eyes distant and unfocused, in a way that had become familiar over the past several days. She looked up as he entered, immediately sensing that something significant had changed in his expression. Jonathan, what is wrong? You look pale. He knelt beside her chair rather than standing over her, wanting, for reasons he could not fully articulate, to be at eye level with her for what he was about to say. I need to show you something. I need you to look at it with an open mind, and I need you to trust me, even though I know I have given you very little reason to do so since the day we married. Confused, but sensing the gravity in his voice, Elena set her book aside and nodded. Jonathan retrieved his phone and pulled up a photograph Daniel had sent him earlier that evening, an old picture of Mia Bennett taken shortly before the accident, her hair lighter, her face slightly different from the one Elena saw in mirrors, but unmistakably, unbearably similar. This is Mia, Jonathan said quietly, holding the phone toward her. The woman I told you about, the one I believed died 3 years ago. Elena stared at the photograph, her chest tightening with an ache she could not explain, the same overwhelming familiarity that had haunted her since her first night in this house, rushing back with sudden, dizzying force. Jonathan, I do not understand what you are trying to tell me. I believe, Jonathan said carefully, his voice shaking, despite his effort to remain steady, that you are her. That the accident that supposedly killed Mia Bennett actually left her alive, with severe memory loss and a new face after reconstructive surgery. I believe your mother, believing she was protecting you, allowed the world to think she had died, and gave you a new name and a new life as Elena Rhodes. The room seemed to spin violently around Elena as the words settled over her, memories she had spent weeks dismissing as strange coincidences suddenly rushing forward all at once, no longer fragments, but a flood too overwhelming to process. The garden that felt like home, the pearl necklace that ached against her skin, the teacup she knew without knowing how, the song she hummed without remembering where she learned it, the dreams of a rain-soaked road, and a younger version of Jonathan laughing beside her among the roses. Play the recording, Jonathan said gently, his voice thick with emotion, pulling up an old voice message he had kept saved on his phone for 3 years, one he had never been able to delete despite the pain it caused him to hear it. Mia's voice filled the room, warm and familiar, laughing about something trivial from years ago, and the moment the sound reached Elena's ears, something inside her broke open completely. The memories arrived not gently, but violently, an avalanche crashing through the careful walls her mind had built to protect her from a trauma too enormous to process gradually. She remembered a garden proposal, beneath the same roses she had wandered through days earlier, Jonathan on one knee, laughing nervously as he fumbled with a ring box. She remembered an argument in a restaurant, tears blurring her vision as she drove away into the rain, accusations about a business associate ringing in her ears. She remembered headlights, a scream, an impact, then nothing, darkness stretching endlessly before waking in a hospital bed, with a stranger's face staring back at her in the reflection of a metal tray. Jonathan, she gasped, her hands flying to her temples as the pain of returning memory overwhelmed her physically, her vision swimming, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I remember the garden, the ring, the argument, the rain. She did not finish the sentence. Her body went rigid, then slack, collapsing sideways out of the chair, before Jonathan could fully catch her. He lowered her gently to the floor, shouting for help, his hands trembling as he checked for her pulse, relief flooding through him when he found it, faint but steady, beneath his fingers. The household erupted into controlled chaos within minutes, Margaret rushing down the stairs at the sound of Jonathan's shouting, Louise calling for an ambulance with shaking hands, Patrick bringing the car around to the front entrance in case it was needed faster than emergency services could arrive. Jonathan refused to leave Elena's side, cradling her carefully as they waited, whispering her name, both names, over and over, as though the repetition alone might keep her tethered to consciousness. "Stay with me," he murmured against her hair, tears he had not allowed himself in 3 years, finally spilling freely down his face. "Please, Mia, Elena, whoever you need to be right now, just please stay with me." The ambulance arrived within minutes, and Elena was rushed to the hospital, Jonathan riding beside her the entire way, refusing to release her hand, even as the paramedics worked to monitor her vitals. The doctors who met them at the emergency entrance recognized immediately the severity of what appeared to be a significant psychological and physical shock, ordering a full battery of tests while Jonathan paced the hallway outside, his mind replaying every moment since her arrival at the estate, every small clue he had failed to piece together sooner, every day he had wasted mourning a woman who had been alive and suffering under a stolen identity the entire time. Margaret arrived at the hospital an hour later, her face pale and drawn, and found her son slumped in a plastic chair outside the examination room, his head in his hands. She sat beside him without a word at first, then finally placed a hesitant hand on his shoulder. "Is it true?" she asked quietly. "What Daniel told you." "It is true," Jonathan said, his voice hollow. "She has been alive this entire time, Mother, and I let her marry me as a stranger, treated her coldly, mourned her death while she sat across the dinner table from me every single night." Margaret's eyes filled with tears of her own. "None of us knew, Jonathan. None of us could have known." "She knows now," Jonathan said, staring at the closed door of the examination room. "And I do not know what state she will be in when she wakes up, or whether she will ever forgive any of us for the years this lie stole from her." The hours that followed passed with agonizing slowness, Jonathan refusing to leave the hospital corridor even as exhaustion pulled at his body, his mind fixed entirely on the closed door ahead of him and the woman lying behind it, finally beginning to remember a love he had never truly stopped feeling, even when he believed it buried forever beneath 3 years of careful, protective grief. Elena woke the following morning to soft sunlight filtering through hospital blinds, and the steady, familiar sound of a heart monitor beeping quietly beside her bed. For a disoriented moment, she stared at the unfamiliar ceiling, trying to piece together where she was and why her body felt so heavy with exhaustion. Then the memories returned, not violently this time, but steadily, settling into place with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after the chaos of the previous night. She remembered everything now. She remembered her real name, Mia Bennett, spoken by her mother, in a voice thick with love throughout her childhood. She remembered meeting Jonathan at a charity event years ago, the way his usual guarded reserve had cracked into genuine laughter within minutes of their first conversation. She remembered falling in love slowly and completely, remembered their engagement, their plans for a future neither of them ever got the chance to build together, before it was violently interrupted. Jonathan sat asleep in a chair beside her bed, his head tilted awkwardly against the wall, dark circles evident beneath his closed eyes from a night spent refusing to leave her side. Elena watched him for a long moment, her heart aching with a tenderness that felt both entirely new and deeply, comfortingly familiar all at once. "Jonathan," she said softly, and his eyes opened immediately, alert despite his exhaustion, relief flooding his face the moment he saw her awake and lucid. "Mia," he breathed, then caught himself, uncertain which name she preferred now that the truth had fully surfaced. "Elena, I am sorry. I do not know what to." "Mia is fine," she said gently, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like years, though in reality, it had only been a single difficult night. "I remember everything now, Jonathan. I remember us." He moved to sit on the edge of her bed, taking her hand carefully in both of his, as though afraid she might disappear again if he did not hold on tightly enough. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice breaking, "for every cold word, every dismissive glance since the day you arrived at the estate. I did not know I was pushing away the very woman I had spent 3 years mourning." "You could not have known," Mia said, squeezing his hand reassuringly. "None of us knew. My mother believed she was protecting me. You believed you had lost me forever. We were both victims of a lie neither of us created." Over the following days, as doctors monitored her recovery and confirmed that the physical shock to her system had passed without lasting harm, Mia and Jonathan spent long hours together, piecing apart the full scope of what had happened 3 years earlier. Daniel Foss visited the hospital personally, bringing additional documentation that confirmed, beyond any reasonable doubt, Victor Callahan's involvement in the tampered brakes that had caused the accident, as well as the financial arrangement he had orchestrated with Nora to ensure Mia's true identity remained buried. "He needs to answer for what he did," Mia said firmly, sitting up in her hospital bed with a strength and clarity that surprised even herself, given how fragile she had felt only days earlier. "Not just for the accident, but for 3 years he stole from both of us. 3 years my mother spent living in fear. 3 years you spent grieving a death that never actually happened." "I agree completely," Jonathan said, his expression hardening with a resolve that had been sharpening steadily since Daniel's initial report. "I intend to make sure Victor Callahan faces full consequences, both legally and professionally. He will not simply walk away from this untouched." Nora visited the hospital as well, arriving with a fragile, hesitant hope that her daughter might be willing to hear her out despite everything. Mia, though still processing the full weight of her mother's deception, found she could not sustain anger toward a woman who had made an impossible decision under impossible pressure, believing at the time that she was protecting her only remaining child from further harm. "I forgive you, Mother," Mia said quietly, watching relief and grief mixed together across Nora's tear-streaked face. "I understand why you made the choice you did, even though it cost us both more than either of us could have imagined. But there can be no more secrets between us, not after everything this lie has already taken." "Never again," Nora promised, gripping her daughter's hand tightly. "I will help however I can to make this right." Together, the three of them, along with Daniel's carefully compiled evidence, began building a case strong enough to expose Victor Callahan's involvement in the accident and the elaborate cover-up that followed. Jonathan reached out quietly to contacts within the police department who had originally dismissed the tampered brake evidence, providing them with Daniel's findings and pressing for the case to be formally reopened. Margaret, once she fully understood the depth of Callahan's betrayal, offered the full weight of the Hale family's legal resources to ensure the case would not be buried a second time. Word began to spread within business circles that something significant was unfolding around Victor Callahan's company. Whispers of an old accident resurfacing with new evidence, of a falsified death certificate, of a young woman who had returned, quite literally, from the grave to reclaim a life that had been stolen from her. Callahan, sensing the walls closing in around him, attempted to reach out to Nora directly, hoping to intimidate her back into silence, but she refused his calls entirely, standing firm for the first time in 3 years, finally free of the fear that had controlled her decisions since the night of the accident. By the time Mia was discharged from the hospital, cleared fully by her doctors, and stronger than she had felt in longer than she could remember, the case against Victor Callahan had gained enough momentum that his arrest felt less like a distant possibility and more like an inevitable certainty. Jonathan drove her back to the estate himself, and as they passed through the front gates, Mia looked up at the grand stone house with entirely new eyes, no longer seeing a prison she had been forced into, but a home she was, impossibly, finally returning to as herself. 3 weeks later, Victor Callahan was formally arrested at his downtown office, led out in handcuffs past stunned employees, while news cameras captured the moment for evening broadcasts across the city. The evidence Daniel Foss had compiled, combined with a police investigation reopened under significant pressure from the Hale family's legal team, proved more than sufficient to charge him with the tampering that had caused the accident 3 years earlier, as well as fraud related to the falsified death certificate and the financial arrangement made with Nora Rhodes to ensure her silence. The story spread quickly through both business circles and public news outlets, a tale almost too extraordinary to believe. A young woman presumed dead for 3 years, discovered alive under a stolen identity, married unknowingly to the very man she had once been engaged to before an accident, orchestrated by a rival businessman, tore their lives apart. Reporters clamored for interviews, but Jonathan and Mia declined every request, preferring to protect what remained of their privacy as they worked to rebuild a life together that had been so violently interrupted. At the estate, preparations began quietly for what Jonathan insisted would be a proper wedding, one neither of them had truly experienced the first time, given the rushed, businesslike nature of their original ceremony. Margaret, who had softened considerably since learning the full truth of what her son and his wife had endured, threw herself into the planning with genuine enthusiasm, determined to give them the celebration that circumstance had denied them years earlier. The ceremony took place in the same rose garden where Jonathan had originally proposed to Mia years before, the same garden that had called to her with unexplainable familiarity from the very first morning she arrived at the estate as a stranger to her own life. The roses bloomed in full that afternoon, deep red and soft white blossoms filling the air with a fragrance that Mia now understood, at last, why it had always felt so achingly like home. Nora stood among the small gathering of guests, tears of genuine joy streaming down her face, as she watched her daughter walk down a simple garden path toward the man she had loved long before losing herself entirely. Louise, who had carried the weight of recognizing Mia from the very first day, without daring to speak the truth aloud, wept openly during the ceremony, relief and happiness finally replacing the guilt she had silently carried for weeks. Jonathan stood waiting at the end of the path, dressed simply, his eyes never leaving Mia as she approached. The same overwhelming love he had felt years earlier, now returning, with a depth made only richer by everything they had survived to reach this moment. When she finally reached him, he took her hands gently in his, echoing words he had once spoken to her, beneath these same roses, before rain and betrayal, and 3 years of grief, had stolen the chance to fulfill them. "I promised you forever once before," Jonathan said, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "Circumstances outside our control took that promise from us, but I am standing here today to make it again, this time with full knowledge of exactly who you are, and exactly how much you mean to me. I love you, Mia. I have loved you every single day since the moment we met, even during the years I believed you were gone, even when I did not yet understand that you were standing right in front of me all along. I love you too," Mia replied, tears of happiness slipping freely down her cheeks. "I do not know why fate chose such a painful path to bring us back together, but I am endlessly grateful it did not let us stay lost to each other forever." They exchanged simple vows beneath the roses, surrounded by family who had, in their own imperfect ways, fought to protect them through years of confusion and hidden truth. When Jonathan finally kissed her, the garden around them seemed to hold its breath in celebration, roses swaying gently in the afternoon breeze, as though welcoming home a love that had never truly disappeared, only waited patiently, hidden beneath layers of grief and deception, for the right moment to bloom again. In the months that followed, Jonathan and Mia built a life together that felt, at last, entirely their own, free of contracts and obligations, free of secrets and stolen names. Victor Callahan faced trial and was sentenced to significant time in prison for his role in the accident and subsequent cover-up, finally held accountable for the years of pain his ambition had caused 2 families who deserved far better. Nora moved closer to the estate, rebuilding her relationship with her daughter, slowly but steadily, grateful beyond words for a second chance she had never believed she would receive. And in the quiet evenings that followed, Jonathan no longer needed a locked room to hold on to memories of a love he had lost. Instead, he found Mia beside him every night, laughing in the same garden, humming the same familiar songs, no longer a hidden love mourned in silence, but a wife fully known, fully chosen, and finally, completely home.